So by definition, an ecosystem is a complex network of interconnected systems which emphasize the interaction between living and non-living parts and the flow of materials and energy between these parts. So if we just take that definition for now, a complex network of interconnected systems, well, that's exactly what our dog is as a whole organism. It is a complex network of interconnected systems. It has all these different physiological systems, all these anatomical systems that communicate to each other. They communicate to each other because they pulsate life, they pulsate chemistry, they pulsate electromagnetic frequencies, so they're in constant communication with each other. The whole point of that constant communication is for one thing, and that's for safety. To tell the body that it is safe, and when it's not safe, and where these compromises come in. A complex network of interconnected systems which emphasize the interaction between living and non-living parts and the flow of materials and energy between these parts. So now we can start to have an understanding of our dog as an ecosystem. What does it mean to have a dog as a whole organism, and how we create resilience for our dog's ecosystem, how we create a stable ecosystem for that animal. Equally, how that dog interacts with an ecosystem on a bigger picture. How stable is the dog's ecosystem in terms of its habitat and its environment? What disturbances are around that might affect the dog's ecosystem as an individual? And something that blows my mind, and you'll hear me talk about later on in the Canine Wellness Wheel, the microbiome. The microbiome that surrounds anything and everything. The microbiome that is on your dog and within your dog. That in itself is an ecosystem. That in itself is subject to change, disturbance and competition that actually affects the very health and wellness of our dogs. When it comes to understanding how we can create a resilient ecosystem, how we can create a dog that has this strong and stable ecosystem, we need to have an understanding of what wellness also is. Why does wellness allow for health? Why does wellness provide health? And what is its definition? Because wellness is key to ecosystem stability. Wellness is key to health. Wellness is about physical, physiological, psychological and spiritual health and being connected with nature. So it's looking at the dog as a whole organism. How disturbances arise not just physically, not just physiologically, not just psychologically and so on and so forth, but in every aspect of that dog's ecosystem. As well as the dog being connected to an ecosystem itself. Maintaining the relaxation response must include the ability to think clearly, have restful sleep, good diet and digestion, abundant energy, healthy skin, balanced behaviours and a sense of peace. All of these are important for wellness. So when we look at our dog as a genetically ancient canine living in a modern day world, can we happily and comfortably admit, can we happily and comfortably say that our dog has all of these as a tick list, all of these as a sheet, where we know our dog has good diet and digestion, so its wellness is not compromised on that level. We know a dog has healthy skin, so its ecosystem is stable yet again on that level. But what about if a dog is stressed emotionally? Is that dog able to learn clearly? Is the dog able to process information clearly? Or is the dog absorbing information from a nervous system perspective that is going to stimulate and promote sympathetic activity, something that we want to avoid, rather than promoting parasympathetic activity? Activity of an ecosystem that is one for rest, one for growth, one for movement, and one for living in a life that is comfortable and that is safe. Now in there, which confuses some people, was being connected with nature. Now, our dogs don't go around the houses and streets like we do with our shoes and socks on. Of course, they have their paws that are naked and touch the ground. But there's some really, really important aspects that we need to offer our dogs when we look at canine wellness and when we address this issue of being connected with nature. Now, unfortunately, this is what some of the course will cover, but unfortunately, as humans, we are becoming more and more disconnected to nature, more and more disconnected to biodiversity, more and more disconnected to actually the ancestral human being that we are, this genetically evolutionary human that we are, that now equally lives in modern day world. And that's causing things like depression, digestive issues, chemical imbalances, general feelings of low mood, suppression, and also ill health, physical ill health. And there's some really amazing studies now, some of them are called Shinrin Yoku, some really amazing studies now that basically are proving the importance and need of actually getting outside, getting to the beautiful great outdoors, and just allowing our body, allowing our sensory systems to absorb all of that beauty and all of that goodness and all of that health that nature provides. Now, the problem that happens with our dogs, our domestic dogs that coexist with us humans, is that they equally are in this modern day world, where some, not all, but some of our dogs get denied this beautiful opportunity of going out in nature, of getting muddy, of enjoying a little paddle in the river, of enjoying running through the leaves and forests, and how supportive that is for the body. So one of the things that I'll talk about in the course are the parallels of disturbances that happen in a human ecosystem and how that can cause imbalances within the dog's ecosystem as well, and how that can create disturbance within the dog's ecosystem. So there's some really amazing studies out there now. As I say, one of these collectively is called Shinrin Yoku. Now, this is a 20-year study that largely happened in Japan that looked at the disease incidences, emotional disturbances, things like depression, sadness, low mood, even effects on the digestive system by simply not getting out into nature. Now, one of the things that excites me the most, more than food, I'm a big foodie, but something that excites me more than food are ecosystems, which I'm already spending a lot of time talking about, but also biodiversity. Biodiversity is so important. And one of the things that I'll look at later on in one of the courses is ecosystem services, and how biodiversity itself is an ecosystem service, and how that can support our dog's wellness as well as our own. Now, on that list of wellness and definition of wellness was being connected with nature. There's a difference between a city dog and a dog getting out to rural environments, a dog living in a rural environment. And that is because being out in a space, being out in nature, provides for so much health quality. There is something that's being talked a lot about at the moment, the hygiene hypothesis, how more and more humans are developing westernized diseases, allergies, food intolerances, asthma, even diabetes. And that is because being born and living in an urban environment is actually moving them away from the presence of bacteria and environmental factors that our body as a genetically ancient human, just like our dogs as a genetically ancient canine, should be and need to be exposed to. So when I talk about being connected with nature, I really mean that. I mean not getting out into the city, not getting our dogs outside to be exercised on a daily basis, and we'll talk about that later. I mean the importance from a biological perspective in maintaining and creating stability, a healthy and resilient ecosystem by being outside, by being out in the rural environments, and the health benefits and wellness benefits that that provides, not just for ourselves, but also for our dogs. So we've already had a definition of wellness, and just to kind of anchor that and cement that more into your minds about considering our dog and really viewing our dog as a whole organism, an ecosystem in itself, and how we create this resilient ecosystem, how we create this ecosystem health and stability. It's about understanding wellness and understanding our dog so they live a happy and safe and comfortable life by looking at it from an integrative perspective, by combining different factors, different subjects and different disciplines together so we can provide the best that we can for our dogs. Now, many years ago, and even to this day, we have this approach called a Newtonian approach. It keeps everything simple and it allows us to study things in more detail. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that as long as we understand that once we've studied that subject, how that subject attaches to another source, another factor, or equally another subject as well. So the Newtonian effect, or the Newtonian approach, was a simple statement of if there was a change in A, that only affected B. And if there was a change in B, that only affected C, and so on and so forth. But the linear approach is rather limiting, because what we now realise is this beautiful quantum Einsteinian approach, this approach that indigenous tribes have known all along, where everything is connected to everything else. And through the likes of biophoton research and even a deeper understanding of biochemistry and molecular biology, we've been able to find and been able to prove that even DNA itself emits a very low frequency to anything else that is living. This doesn't include other animals, but also plants, waters, rocks, absolutely everything. It's a really fascinating area of study. And to really express that point, there's a beautiful book by Richard Gerber. I mean, it's a big book, so, take yourself away, find a quiet space, have a bottle of wine if you drink, or some chocolate and ice cream if you're like me. That's your positive reinforcement. But it's a really, really good book called Vibrational Medicine. And he has a really lovely sentence, or Richard has a really lovely sentence in this book, which states, animals are networks of complex energy fields that interface with physical cellular systems. These systems are powerfully affected by emotions, spiritual balance, nutrition, and environmental factors. So by taking this wellness approach, by understanding our dogs as an ecosystem and what an ecosystem means, by understanding our dogs as a genetically ancient canine, living in a modern day world and all these stresses that the dog is exposed to, we can have an understanding of how our dog is interacting at multiple levels, how a dog is interacting as an integrative system, and the different subjects and disciplines that we need to understand in order to look at how we safeguard our dogs, in order how we understand their wellness, and how we create this resilient ecosystem, or how we can realign a dog's ecosystem when disturbances arise. And I'm going to give you a really crude example. So, let's say, for example, a dog is in a situation where its emotional state has now changed. A dog that goes into an environment where they normally feel really safe and relaxed is now starting to feel a little bit distressed, a little bit uncertain. It might be in this example that the dog is noise sensitive, that has a phobia or a sensitivity around noise. And all of a sudden, a firework might have gone off, a car might have backfired, it might have hurt a motorbike, or whatever. But the dog's emotional state, the dog's emotional system is now in disarray. It's now in disturbance because a dog has heard a noise that it is uncertain of, unsure of. Now, as a result of that, and a result of that input, we are going to see a cascade of events, a cascade of changes that can happen within the dog's ecosystem, whether we can visually see them and sense them, or maybe we can't. Because first and foremost, although our dogs are a constellation of physical systems, they're also a constellation of energy systems. And when disturbances arise, the first system that gets affected is the energy system. So we have a situation now where the dog has a fear of noise. We've got this cascade of disturbances and changes occurring now within the body, and we can now explore these further as an example. So there's been a change in the dog's biochemical response, biochemistry, emotional state towards that noise. This is going to have an effect within the dog's system, physiological system. Its nervous system has gone from one of being parasympathetic to now sympathetic. Its energy is aroused, its nervous system is heightened, that old ancient ecosystem of the nervous system is now inflamed. It's now having to act and act in a different way. This can put pressure on the physiological system, the circulatory system, and the organs that deal with fight and flight and fears and stresses. So there are now changes and imbalances occurring within the dog's different systems. This may then change the way that the dog wants to interact with its environment. Now being under pressure from a physiological perspective and emotional state perspective, its interaction with the environment may somewhat change. The dog may not want to go outside. The dog may go outside but is looking anxious, is maybe more irritated, is more frustrated, is maybe not necessarily acting sensibly or certainly the way that he or she used to in previous days or even the day before. Now, in combination with a change in emotional state, changes in systems, changes in interacting with the environment and taking information from that, we may see a change independently or in combination of those factors with how the dog digests food or how the dog chooses to digest food. First and foremost, a very simple example may be simply the dog just cuts off digestion. The dog is that afraid that the animal just doesn't want to eat at that moment in time. It doesn't want to have to focus its energy and attention on breaking down food when it's focusing its energy and attention on feeling safe. It might be that if the dog is feeling vulnerable, it needs a different food source to consume. A food source that is going to be easier on digestion, a food source that is going to support the dog emotionally, something like nurturing food, emotional food. It may be a completely different food source altogether. And by putting all these factors together and these effects together, it can then affect the simple life energy, the simple spiritual aspects of this dog. How belonging does the dog feel? How safe does the dog feel? How connected as an energy system does the dog feel? So when we look at our dogs as ecosystems, when we have an understanding of that definition of wellness, and we have this understanding that our dogs are energy systems, first and foremost before they're physical systems, the many factors that can affect our dog's ecosystem, and how we can create a resilient ecosystem, and the factors that can affect our dog as a whole organism, it's important to have an understanding and to explore as best as we can, as hard as we can, subjects as individuals, but actually bringing them all together so that we can create this integrative approach to canine health, to canine wellness. And in the studies and the research that I do as a canine wellness practitioner, zoologist, conservation biologist, there are many, many things that I read. I spend a lot of my time reading. And some of the books that I read are more focused on Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous wisdom. And one of the books that I read really helped me understand what it is I am trying to achieve, what I want to achieve for dogs, what I want to achieve for wellness, for all of life really. But for now, let's just make it poignant to our dogs. In my research, I read a report by a scientist who's now also a shaman. And in his book, he was giving reports about his introduction to different tribal elders and his understanding about way of life and health. In his book, One Spirit Medicine, Alberto Velodo talked about this time when he went to visit a tribe. It's because what Alberto realised is what many researchers and scientists are realising now, is that the rates of disease and diseases like diabetes, allergies, asthma, skin issues, heart disease, cancers, in our indigenous cultures and those people that lead traditional lives, their disease risk and instant disease is either non-existent or very, very low. Alberta wanted to understand what medicines do these tribes take in order to improve their health and improve their wellness. And his account is a really beautiful account of how we should all be living our lives, including those for our dogs. Alberto tells a beautiful story of how he was speaking to one of the tribal elders. And he asks the elder, "How do you live a long and healthy life?" And the elder looks at him quite quizzically and quite confused and says, "By leading a long and healthy life." And Alberto looks back at him and says, No, you don't understand my question." And the tribal elder smiles and looks at Alberto and says, "No, you don't understand my answer." And it was such a beautiful bit of reading and beautiful information that really helped me understand what it is I am trying to achieve when we look at wellness. Canine wellness, human wellness, wellness for everybody, for all of life. The whole notion is, and what that elder was really trying to imply, we should be living a life where our health span equals our lifespan, where the health span of our dogs equals the lifespan of our dogs. Yes, we all have an expiration date, and it's really sad that our dog's life expectancy is a lot lower than ours. But what it still means to say is that our dogs should lead a life of pure wellness, of complete wellness, where they have a long health and they have long life. They don't have long life and long sickness. And certainly, as a canine wellness professional, that is what I'm seeing. I am seeing dogs that are subject to emotional distresses, skin distresses, disease distresses, physical distresses. What we want to be achieving for our dogs to create a resilient ecosystem, to create a stable ecosystem, is achieving protocols and achieving understandings where their health span equals their lifespan. And the problem that we have today for our dogs as domestic animals is that they are genetically ancient canines that live in a modern day world. And the modern day stresses are becoming more and more and more imbalanced and more disturbed. And that is affecting our dog systems. We are in an ecosystem crisis, and so are our dogs. Our dogs are also in an ecosystem crisis. And the reason why we are in an ecosystem crisis is because of how our change of perception of what is accepted to be normal is changing. But it's not changing for the better, it's changing for the worse. Now, many years ago when I was studying conservation biology and as I was studying my zoology degree, I was taught about this definition, this theory, the shifting baseline theory. And what the shifting baseline teaches and what the shifting baseline talks about is how knowledge is lost over time about the state of the natural world because people's perceptions of change are out of kilter with actual changes taking place. It's almost like something becomes the norm, we therefore accept it as the norm. We kind of forget or choose to ignore that it's becoming a problem, or it is an area of concern. Or we really feel like we've achieved something. Our efforts have been so great that we have made a difference, when actually in comparison to background rates, we've made no to very, very little difference. And for me, as a zoologist and conservation biologist, the shifting baseline theory applies to canine wellness, because our dogs are in an ecosystem crisis. If we simply look at it from a physical perspective, the increase in incidences of dogs that are classified as being obese, today that is 60%. 60% of dogs are classified as being obese. That is an ecosystem crisis. We know the health risks and health damages that can have on a dog or any animal when we are overweight. The extra load that the body has to carry, but also the extra energy that can be generated within the body that can lead to more physical diseases and more distressing diseases and harmful diseases like cancer. Now, as the shifting baseline theory would state, if I was trying to focus on reducing the number of dogs that were classified as being obese from 60% to maybe 40%, I would think I've done good. I would be proud of myself. But really what I want to be doing is taking that percentage right back down to zero. Because it wouldn't have been that long ago when the number of dogs that were classified as being obese was a very, very low percentage. And that is just one example, the number of dogs today that are classified as obese. Let's look at something that's even more distressing, upsetting for our dogs and for us, cancers. In the 1970s, there was only 1 in 10 dogs diagnosed with cancer, and that's not that long ago. Today, there is 1 in 1.65. I mean, that for me is really alarming and it's really, really saddening. If I looked at this figure, 1 in 1.65, and I thought, great, I am going to really try and strive for those rates of cancer in dogs to move from 1 in 1.65 to 1 in 5, I would think I've achieved greatness. When in fact, I haven't really done that much because only in 1970 was the incidence 1 in 10. Our dogs as ecosystems, our dogs as genetically ancient canines living in a modern day world are plagued with so many stresses and so many disturbances that they're really vulnerable, delicate systems. Their immune system, digestive system, nervous system are still struggling to keep up with and haven't even caught up with that all these distresses are fed into that ecosystem and causing the disturbances. There is so many reports now of the issues with diet and incorrect diet, chemical exposure, not just the chemicals that we put onto our dog, but the toxins that our dogs have to breathe on a daily basis. Our dogs' ecosystems are being affected, and the shifting baseline theory is an important factor to consider in terms of what is happening today, what our expectations are, what we see as acceptable, and actually what our expectations should be, and what we should be striving. We should be striving for our dogs to have their health span equal their lifespan. That long life and long health, not long life and long sickness. So through my experience as a canine wellness professional, I went away for some time, had a bit of a scratch on my head and was like, okay, how can I get people to understand and get excited about this concept of how can we make our dog's health span equal their lifespan? How can I get people to understand and view and see their dog as an ecosystem, what an ecosystem really means, and how we can create this resilient ecosystem, and what factors are fed into our dogs as an ecosystem to then create these disturbances. So how we can then look at realigning our dog and making the dog stable. So I came up with the Canine Wellness Wheel, which basically is almost like different pieces of a pie. We can imagine it as a pie. I'm a foodie, I love food, so I always like to imagine a bit of a pie. Different segments of pie, the different factors that are fed into our dog as an ecosystem that can either really create stability for our dog or that can create a nuisance, that can create a disturbance. And some factors are more in depth than others, and some factors can really take a big hold on the dog's disturbance within its ecosystem, and some might be easier to resolve. So simply if we could really just place our dog, we could place our dog's name in the middle and just have a consideration of how does the Canine Wellness Wheel apply to our dog, and how can our dog be affected by these different factors. So it's looking at how resilient is the dog in all its wellness, how we need to realign our dog's ecosystem and our dog's Canine Wellness Wheel. And again, the importance of that we have a duality with our dogs, just as much as ourselves, we have this duality of our dog is an ancestral being. It is a canine that has an indigenous blueprint but lives in a modern day world, so it's also got this element of domestication within it as well, and it's looking at the two of those and how we support that dog's ecosystem. So where do these disturbances come from, or how do these disturbances get within our dog's body, get within our dog's ecosystem? Well, to understand that, we actually need to jump down a microscope a little bit and first and foremost see our dog as a sensory being, see our dog at a cellular level. And this is really, really important. First and foremost, it's really easy for us to see a dog and see a dog as a physical being. But any animal is made up of cells, trillions and trillions of cells that obviously are specialized, that can make eyes and fur and bone and muscles and blood and all these many, many amazing things that make up an animal. But at a cellular level, a cell is alive in itself. A cell gives off a particular beat. A cell has a particular energy. A cell will communicate within itself and also to other cells in and around a localized area or throughout the whole being, and actually then onto other organisms and in other environments, which brings me back to that concept of the biophotons that scientists are now spending a lot of time working on. It's a relatively new, recent area of study, but it's about having this understanding that DNA itself actually is alive. DNA itself gives off very, very low level frequencies and is able to communicate to other organisms, not just within itself, but also outside collectively in the environment. As an example, how plants can communicate with other plants and other living organisms as well. So when we look at a dog at a cellular level, when our dogs feel well, physically, emotionally, physiologically, energy-wise, when they're being fed well, when that ecosystem is good and strong, at a cellular level, the cells communicate very, very differently to one another. It's a little bit like being at a Fatboy Slim concert, which I have had experience of, which is why I compare it to that, because of the particular beat that is going on. So for those of you that like Fatboy Slim, or those of you that have ever been to a Fatboy Slim concert, the beat and the resonance that you can feel is this lovely harmonics of wow, 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 wow. So it's having that concept of that when a dog's body, as I say, physically, physiologically, psychologically, body, mind, soul, spirit, energy, is in a good state of harmony, is balanced, is resilient, then how the cells communicate internally to the entire body to say I feel good are at a particular resonance and a particular frequency. However, disturbances can start to arise, those disturbances that appear within that canine wellness wheel that I'll talk about next. And it starts to change the resonance and frequency that the cells communicate to and communicate within. So sometimes the cells can become very stagnant, so that energy, the chemistry, the resonance that those cells start to emit is very low and very sluggish, and we might see in that sense a dog be like low in energy. Even from a physical perspective, we might see skin repair being slow, or hair growth being slow. The system is sluggish and slow. The other extreme can be where these disturbances arise. It can elevate at a cellular level. It can elevate how these cells communicate to each other, so they can become very, very inflamed and very erratic and very aroused. And that would make sense from a behavioral perspective. If we think when a dog's nervous system becomes aroused, then we can see that kind of that inflamed energy and how the dog shows in its behavior. But much, much deeper than that at a cellular level, we can see it occurring because the cells start to communicate at a much, much higher vibration and a much, much higher frequency. So this is why when we look at canine wellness, there's an element of not just looking at the dog physically, but also at a cellular level, at a chemical level of what's going on internally and how we stabilize the dog. Now, there's a great description of that by a scientist called Bruce Lipton from his book Biology of Belief, who states the whole body is an organ of perception, constantly receiving updates that alter cellular responses. And this is something that we have to bear in mind with our dogs. Our dogs are sensory beings. Our dogs are an organ of perception whose cells are receiving information through the senses of the dog, and the cells are then making decisions on how those responses make those cells feel. How does that chemistry need to change within that cell? How does the vibrational state, the resonance, need to change within that cell? Because the cells are collectively still feeling stable and still feeling strong, or the cells are now starting to change in frequency so that inflammation is occurring at whatever level, or that stagnation is occurring because of these disturbances that may be starting to be fed within the dog. And that's one thing that we have to bear in mind, that I'm a really, really big fan, and I really do believe in saying that there's no such thing as a textbook dog, because unless we wrote a textbook for every dog in existence, every dog is an individual. Every dog is different. What is one dog's fear could be another dog's pleasure. So it's having this understanding that actually what is very difficult in science today is to do scientific studies on live organisms like our dogs, to understand how they work, their expectations, their interactions, because every dog is different. So for example, with my 3 dogs, I interact with them very differently because each one of my dogs has a different level of need, a different level of expectation, a different level of learning, and a different level of daily exercise and daily practice. So it's having that understanding that we have to see our dogs as ecosystems, we have to understand them as whole organisms and this integrative approach, but then with that understanding them as individuals. And that's why from a scientific perspective, it can be really hard to really understand what is going on with our dogs and what can we understand in terms of the biology of the animal, because every dog is different. And I think, you know, that helps a lot of people in certainly when I go out to work with dogs, and getting them to understand that don't compare your dog to anybody else's dog, and don't compare your dog to what your neighbour's dog is doing, or your cousin's dog is doing, or your brother's dog is doing, because that's their dog that's been through a whole different set of circumstances and experiences and lifestyle, and is a totally different ecosystem to what your dog is. But we do have to understand that our dog is a physical being, it is an emotional being, it is an intellectual being, it is a social being, a spiritual being, a sensory being, and also an ancestral being. And understanding all these components in our dog and how we can feed them and how we can support them. And Sarah Bolden does make a lovely statement of energy patterns affect the entire individual. So again, when we're thinking now of our dogs at first and foremost at the moment at a cellular level, of how really when a dog's cells are emitting this resonance, emitting this vibration within itself, that is an energy pattern. So first and foremost, yes, our dogs are a constellation of physical systems, but first and foremost, our dogs are a constellation of energy systems. And it's the energy systems that are affected first and foremost when we look at ecosystem disturbance, when we look at ecosystem distress. So it's looking at how we support an energy system. And to support an energy system, we have to think of our dogs at the individual level, but at the physical level, the physiological level, and the psychological level.